Great. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Rebecca Kobrin, the co-director of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies and the Russell and Bettina Knapp Professor of American Jewish History. Welcome. I'm going to hand it over to Nancy Coe, one of the organizers of a conference that this is the keynote address. Nancy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Kobrin. So before I begin, I want to just thank the folks over at the UCLA Levy Center, particularly Vivian Hollenbeck, Chelsea White, Raina Chung, David Wu, and Sarah Stein, and of course, Professor Kobrin at Columbia, as well as my mighty colleagues, friends, and co-conveners, Rachel Smith and Jesse Stolman over at UCLA for helping to make this conference possible. Now, the aim of our conference is to ask how it is that following Sephardic trajectories might help us reevaluate global histories of race, migration, capital, and environment. This conference emerges at a very particular time in our history, amidst state bans of ethnic studies in the US, the ongoing displacement and dispossession of Palestinians under Israeli military rule, and the deployments of Sephardic histories in both of these projects, not to mention in the discourse of state violence in Turkey, Egypt, and the broader Middle East. The time has well come to account for the political and institutional context within which the study of Jews in Asia and Africa operates. Now, of course, the first question that comes to mind is who counts as a subject of Sephardic studies? Luckily, this is not a new question. Since the inception of Asian American studies in the late 1960s and early 1970s, scholars within that field have similarly been struggling with the epistemological question of its object of knowledge. But as Candace Chu writes in Imagine Otherwise, we shouldn't be thinking about an identity-based paradigm as the foundational basis for any sort of identity-based studies, Asian American studies, Sephardic studies, or Mizrahi studies, but rather a subjectless discourse, one in which we think about Asian Americanness or Sephardicness, not as an identity, but rather as a flexible critical orientation, one that might lay bare the power relations of knowledge production. So our hope in this conference is that through the work of emerging scholars, journalists, artists, and activists, we can not only interrogate the politics of knowledge production within Sephardic studies today, but also envision how the next generation of scholarship on Jews in and from Asia and Africa might relate to scholarly and lay audiences outside of Sephardic studies. To that end, it's my absolute delight to introduce Professor Rebecca Kobrin, with whom I have had countless conversations over the years. She is the Russell and Bettina Knapp Professor of American Jewish History, and she will be sort of our MC for today. She's the author of Jewish Bialystok and Its Diaspora, 2010 with Indiana University Press, as well as a number of edited volumes on the history of capitalism and Jewish trajectories, alongside Adam Teller as well. Take it away, Rebecca, please.
Thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to introduce, and the way we're going to do this is I'm going to introduce our main keynote speaker and then our respondent, and they're going to just go right ahead. But if questions arise over the course of both the lecture we're going to hear and the response, please just put it in the Q&A and we'll try to speak about it later. So our keynote address will be given by Joseph Sassoon, the Professor of History and Political Economy at Georgetown Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and he holds the Al-Saba Chair in Politics and Political Economy of the Arab World. He is also a senior associate member of St. Anthony College's, Oxford. His research in general is about political economy, economic history of Iraq, Iraqi refugees, and authoritarianism. Among his many books, there is The Iraqi Refugees, The New Crisis in the Middle East, and his prize-winning book, Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party Inside an Authoritarian Regime, which won the prestigious British Kuwait Prize for Best Book on the Middle East. But today he is speaking with us about his most recent publication. It has already come out in England and it will be coming out in the United States in October. Global Merchants, the Enterprise and Extravagance of the Sassoon Dynasty, which indeed speaks to all the themes we're going to be talking about, that the conference spoke about yesterday and we'll be doing next week. His respondent today is Mark Mazower, the Ira D. Wallach Professor of History, who specializes in modern Greece, 20th century Europe, international history. He writes for numerous publications such as The Nation, the London Review of Books, the Financial Times, and he has written much about Greek history. I'm not going to go through everything that he has written because there's too many, but I just want to talk about two books that I think would be of interest to this group that is thinking about understanding how Jewish history intersects with other histories. So his award-winning book, Salonika, City of Ghosts, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, won numerous prizes. This came after his previous books, The Balkans, which won the Wolfson History Prize. I'm going to just skip to his intergenerational biography that came out in 2018, What You Did Not Tell, which speaks about his family of East European Jews and speaks about how we write biography, leftist, the history of the left, the history of Jewish history. And most notably, his most recent book, which won I want to just get it, I want to get the prize correct. The Greek Revolution, which just came out and was just awarded the Duff Cooper Prize just weeks ago, which speaks about how Greek history and thinking about the history of modern Greece makes us rethink about Europe. So I thank both Professor Sassoon and Professor Mazower for their thoughts today in thinking about the larger themes and questions this conference is trying to get at. So Joseph Sassoon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rebecca and Nancy and the organizers at UCLA. Let me just share my screen with you. Okay. So the book has many facets: the life of a Baghdadi Jewish family, trade and colonialism, family rifts and issues facing dynasties, globalization in the 19th century and what it meant for global traders, Anglicization and the desperate need for immigrant families to be accepted in new homelands, and why some dynasties declines and other continue. In today's talk, I will focus on what it meant to be a Baghdadi Jewish family and the connection to their place of birth. But I will also talk briefly about trade and other aspects given their importance in the story. The family in Baghdad lived in Baghdad, where Jews had a continuous presence in Mesopotamia for some 2,500 years, since the forced exile in the 6th century BC following the conquest of Judea by the Babylonians. There were thriving Jewish communities in all cities of what is now called Iraq, and there were likely more Jews there than anywhere else in the Arab East. According to a rabbi who visited Baghdad in 1824, there were about 6,000 Jewish families and 5 large synagogues in Baghdad at the time of his visit. A later traveler estimated 7,000 Jews out of a total city population of 50,000 and noted the prominent role Jews played in the province. The community, which came to be known as Babylonian Jewry, possessed its own language called Baghdadi Jewish, a dialect of Arabic written in Hebrew letters. The family seems to have kept every scrap of paper. Their archives stretch for more than 100 years, and they engage in copious correspondence, both for business and for social matters. Almost all the business correspondence, at least until 1920, was written in this language, the Baghdadi Jewish, mainly to prevent outsiders from reading their letters. Note, this is an example of one of those letters, but really similar to all the others. There is no paragraph. The beginning is very formal. It jumps from one subject to another. There is plenty of criticism once you get into the middle of the letter, complaining about different issues. But interestingly, reputation of the family keeps coming up as one of the most important aspects. And social news began to be written in English in later period. So who founded the family, this dynasty? Well, the family, as I said, lived in Baghdad for hundreds of years, but in the early 19th century, conflicts with the governor who was embezzling taxes led Sheikh Sassoon bin Saleh, who for years acted as the tax collector for the Sultan, to leave Baghdad with his family. After a year in Bushehr in southern Iran, he died, but his family, now headed by the son David in the picture, moved to Bombay. There have been many erroneous versions of why David and his father, Sheikh Sassoon, fled Baghdad. These versions were even repeated by members of the family, but research in the Ottoman archives clearly debunks the idea that anti-Semitism was the reason for the escape. Baghdad and its merchants suffered at the hands of a corrupt wali, Dawood Pasha, a governor, who was known, as I said, to embezzle money from these families. If they refused, he would arrest one of the sons until he received a ransom. Indeed, David, the son, was arrested to put pressure on his father, the sheikh, who paid a ransom. And David fled immediately, followed by his father after his release. All David's siblings stayed and lived in Baghdad, and I am the descendant of one of those siblings. It seems that during the year at Bushehr, father and son learned about commercial opportunities in Bombay from visiting British officials and from traders based around the Persian Gulf ports. Bushehr itself was slowly re-emerging as a commercial port and a bustling center for the East India Company in Persia, with Indian merchants passing through on ships flying the British ensign. All this allowed the Sassoon to learn about India in general and Bombay in particular. When David Sassoon arrived in Bombay, sometimes in 1832, he began a new chapter in the history of the Sassoon family. Bombay's inhabitants at the time numbered no more than 200,000, but were very diverse: Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, Armenians, Portuguese, and Jews. There was a Jewish connection with Bombay from the 16th century, as one of the eminent Portuguese traders residing in Baghdad was a Jew. But there was no community until the second half of the 18th century, when 4 different migrations came to the city. The first was native Jew caste known as Bnei Israel. The second was Arab Jews from the Ottoman provinces of Baghdad, Basra, and Aleppo. The third was Cochin Jews from the Malabar coast, and the fourth were Persian-speaking Jews from Afghanistan, Bukhara, and Mashhad in Iran. By the 1830s, there were approximately 20 to 30 families, and these families called themselves, quote, Jewish merchants of Arabia, inhabitants and residents in Bombay, end of quote. One traveler to the city in 1837 estimated the number of Baghdadis at 350, which represented less than 1% of the total population. Later on, Arab Jews were referred to erroneously as Baghdadi Jews, irrelevant of where they came from, as long as they were from Muslim countries. Let me just talk a little bit briefly so you know when I am talking about different characters. So 5 main characters took center stage in the book. David Sassoon, which I just talked about, his eldest son, Abdullah, who moved to England and became anglicized with the name Albert. He was knighted and became known as Sir Albert. His second son, Elias, who built the business in China. Farha, later on to become Flora, the first woman in the family to run the global business, and I argue in the book probably was one of the only global CEOs at the time at the end of the 19th century. And finally, Sir Victor Sassoon, who presided over the business in its last 25 years. There are, of course, many other characters in the book: the art collector, politician, Philip Sassoon, and of course, the famous World War I poet, Siegfried Sassoon. While David did not have any experience in trading, he benefited from 2 intangible assets: extensive contacts in the Gulf and Persia as a result of the family involvement for many years in collecting taxes on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan in the province of Baghdad, and their good reputation among the merchant families in the Ottoman Empire and Persia. Yet, in spite of all these preparations, it must have been daunting to take his young family and siblings across the Arabian Sea to a foreign city where no family member resided and far away from home in Baghdad. Family was of immense importance to David. His first wife died at a young age in Baghdad after bearing him 2 sons and 2 daughters. His second wife, who outlived him, gave birth to 6 sons and 4 daughters. It was a small army of 14 children. The sons were trained in business from their youth and were later sent to different locations, such as Baghdad and the Gulf, to meet other traders, gain experience, learn Arabic, and receive all the Jewish education from rabbis in Baghdad. Once in Bombay, David realized that the fate and success of the family had to be tied to the British Empire, and the firm of David Sassoon and Sons began a long connection serving British colonial, economic, and political interests wherever they had branched out. Although he neither set foot in Britain nor spoke English, David Sassoon was granted British citizenship in recognition of his services. He was fluent in Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, and Turkish, but somehow never learned English. 20 years after his arrival in Bombay, he swore the oath of allegiance to the British, and he still had not learned enough English to sign his own name. It was signed in Hebrew. Growing in the Ottoman Empire, he never understood why his oath of allegiance was not only to a sovereign, but also to the East India Company, which controlled India at the time. Despite his identification with the British and loyalty to their empire, even when he began to attend ceremonies where British officials lauded his generosity, he invariably replied in his native Arabic. It is important to underline that Arabic was very important for the first and second generation of the Sassoons. His son Abdullah, who inherited him, was not different in this regard, in spite of his keen interest in all things British. Arabic remained his primary language, and he insisted that his family and employees learn it well. In one letter, he mandated that all clerks in Bombay to be able to write in Arabic. In another, by the 1890s, he expressed surprise and irritation at the inability of any of the clerks in Hong Kong to write the language properly. David was by nature risk-averse and studied every possible difficulty. In 1843-44, he sent his second son, Elias, to explore the possibility of expanding into China. After spending times in Canton, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, Elias reported back on the tremendous opportunities in this enormous country. This coincided with the end of the First Opium War, 1839-1842, and the opening of Shanghai to foreigners. By the early 1850s, Elias settled in Shanghai and began reporting daily to his father in Bombay. The year 1858 was an important turning point in the destiny of the Sassoons dynasty. 2 major events occurred: the legalization of opium in China and the dissolution of the British East India Company. The latter followed the unexpected Indian rebellion against the British in 1857, after which the British government took direct control of India, opening free trades to Indians and foreigners. This allowed families such as the Sassoons to capitalize on the vast opportunities in India. By the late 1850s, the family has significantly expanded in different parts of Asia and the world. And this map shows you clearly this expansion. Note that most of the expansion is around port cities. The 3 red stars are the major hubs. The first hub was Bombay, then Shanghai, and then by the 1860s, 70s, London becomes the 3rd hub. So let me just talk briefly about the business. Two commodities changed Bombay financially and led to the rise of new global merchants, cotton and opium. Though David Sassoon was not involved in those commodities initially, he monitored closely the trading scene in Bombay. His name is not mentioned in the archives or local newspapers throughout the 1830s and the beginning of the 1840s. David Sassoon's rise to be among the top businessmen of Bombay was slow and gradual. There was not a one event or trade that changed the picture radically. He just kept developing a network of local and foreign traders and trustworthy counterparts and learning not only where the opportunities lie, but also the ins and outs of trade and negotiations. He would spend days, for example, by the cotton exchange, talking to traders, agents, and scrutinizing the international news. David was convinced to enter the cotton market by witnessing the surge in demand for Indian cotton after the panic caused by the failure of the American crop in late 1850s. Powerful trade circles such as the Manchester Chamber of Commerce had recognized that India could displace America as the most important source for this white gold. But until the 1850s, high transportation costs made Indian cotton less attractive. The steady increase in Indian production from 1858, however, coincided with British imperialist views and the burgeoning role of free trade. The outbreak of the American Civil War and consequent collapse of American exports of cotton provoked skyrocketing prices and a frenzy of speculation. As Sven Beckett wrote, quote, cotton shipment changed hands many times between speculators before delivered to factories. With each exchange, a small profit could be made, end of quote. The value of cotton more than quadrupled in the first 2 years of war, pushing Indian peasants to increase their production. There were even rumors that people were tearing apart their mattresses and selling the cotton. Before long, however, there were signs that the market was losing steam and too many traders had too much stock. The explosive growth of cotton in India had been matched in other countries such as Egypt and Brazil, and global oversupply was a major concern. By April 1865, reports circulated that cotton traders were experiencing big losses and that the steep fall in prices was creating havoc as traders did their utmost to unload their stock. When the war ended, panic spread around the world from Bombay to Liverpool. A year later, reports carried details of a Bombay devastated financially, with estimates of 80% of the traders near bankruptcy. As one brother admitted to another, he could not sleep for worry and opined that every member of the family had to be vigilant in order to avoid large losses, since that would damage the most important element in their business, their reputation, which was sacrosanct. The violent swings in cotton prices illustrates how global merchants conducted their business in the mid-19th century without a fast communication system. Although the telegraph was available, it was very expensive and not confidential. The business was set up so each major hub has its own house and each house made independent decisions. The relationship of trust among the branches allowed these family merchants to prosper, but it also led to constant recriminations and friction. It was essential that each house gather accurate information, not only about the market, but what competitors and brokers did or intended to do. Information was therefore at the core of most merchants' activities. Exacerbating the scarcity of reliable information was the fact that some employees or agents working for merchants were willing to sell the information to competitors. Obviously, it was difficult to manage risk from a distance. Here, the Sassoons had advantages. Sons and sons-in-law of David were scattered and each reported back to head office in their language of Baghdadi Jewish. Also, David was the first of the merchant families in India to send a son to London. This proved to be critical as the son had more information about the Civil War than those in India, which gave the family a big advantage. Volatile times needed nerves of steel and experience. What is remarkable was the young age of most of these sons sent to all corners of the world to run the business. Elias went to explore the possibilities in China, barely 17 years old. The son running Hong Kong was about 24, and the one in Shanghai was 23 years old. So let me switch to the other commodity that made up both the Sassoon and Bombay, opium. There is no doubt that British imperialism and colonial interests forced China to purchase opium. The Sassoon probably began trading it in the middle 1840s after Elias arrived in China, and they stopped trading only after the First World War. Initially, they were very small players in comparison to some Indian traders or British firms such as Jardine Matheson. And only later, the Sassoon, the Sassoons became a significant part of the trade. While opium had been used for thousands of years in India and China, both for medical and recreational use, the British victory in the Anglo-Chinese Opium Wars in the mid-19th century opened the door to the export of large quantities of Indian opium to China. This became an integral part of a triangular trade. British people were buying tea because they were addicted to tea and developed a taste for Chinese silk, but had nothing to export to China in return. Opium filled the gap and for decades made up roughly 16% of India's revenue. It became the world's most valuable traded commodity in 1860 and remained so for a quarter of a century. In the words of one Indian scholar, Bombay became a great commercial and industrial center thanks to the opium business. By the 1850s, opium did become a part and parcel of the family trading business. The opium trade began to weaken by the 1890s due to international and regional factors. Opium is a case study of how interrelated business and politics were during the global expansion. Consistent from the beginning, the Sassoons mustered all their connection and political clout with the British government to ensure favorable opium trade terms. It was intertwined with the British ideology of a free trade and its colonial policy. The Sassoons built strong relations with British politicians to aid them keeping up the trade. They exerted pressure on China and ensured that commissions of inquiry, such as the one you see here, 1895, reach the conclusions they desire. In my book, I have extensive analysis of opium trade. I'm happy also to discuss it. Apart from opium and cotton, the other main commodities were tea, silk, indigo, rice, and pearls. The Sassoons were very cautious before embarking on trading in a new commodity. They researched the subject thoroughly and analyzed the risk and rewards. The Sassoons did not engage in money lending. They invested in banks around the globe to gain information and credit if needed. What was important for merchant families who were expanding globally was not the religious beliefs of anyone, but what they really cared about was, can they trust their counterparts, given that they were trading from far and rarely met or spoke to other traders or agents? Hence their emblem, which was created in the late 1880s. Their crest symbolized the importance of trust, as you could see, Emet ve'emunah in Hebrew and Candid et Constante in Latin. You could see also some signs of their The palm tree, partly religious symbol, but also symbolizes something about their home. Another tenet by which David lived, and that was followed by his successor, was the importance of charitable donations to social causes in all the countries in which they settled. And this was a truly innovative aspect in their business. In their accounting, they taxed every trade they were to do with what they called a tzedakah tax or a mitzvah tax, which was 0.25% for each transaction, irrelevant of whether the trade was profitable or not. And so you would see in their ledger books, cost of merchant in maritime insurance, and then comes the tzedakah. It doesn't seem a lot, 0.25%, but given the fact they did hundreds and hundreds of trade at the time, it added to huge amounts. A lot of things happened with these donations. Some of it was synagogues. These are two synagogues that are still active. This one to the right, the blue one, the Magen David, is in Bombay. It has been restored about 5-6 years ago by the Indian government. It's absolutely beautiful. To the left is in Pune, where actually in the grounds, David Sassoon is buried there. The fact that the governor of Bombay from 1834 to 1838 was Sir Robert Grant, who lobbied in the British Parliament for the repeal of, quote, civil disabilities affecting British-born subjects, end of quote, meant that the city was exceptionally welcoming to Jewish traders. So of the poor and young in cities such as Bombay, this was still exists today in the heart of Mumbai, the David Sassoon Library. Before that, it was Institute for teaching young people in Bombay. He also contributed to Jewish schools, hospitals. There is a very large hospital still in Pune under the name Sassoon Hospital. The family that were active in the local councils, politics, realized that their new home afforded them safety and security. They purchased grand houses in Bombay, and when they moved to England, also purchased impressive houses. And similar to the English in India, had a beautiful house in a hill station side where they escaped the heat of Bombay. This is kind of a collection of different houses in whether in India. You could see the one, the Souci in Bombay. It's today a very, very large hospital. And again, it's in the heart of Mumbai. After David's death in 1834, his will dictated that Abdullah, the eldest son, takes over the company, but the second son, Elias, refused. And after 3 years of attempts to bridge the chasm, 2 Sassoon companies were created, David Sassoon and Co. and Edie Sassoon. The severe competition within these 2 companies pushed both sides to take more risk and even be innovative, but the rift also weakened them both in the long run. The Sassoons' decline began in the late 19th century and gathered momentum with the Japanese invasion of Shanghai in 1937. The family's wealth declined with every generation due either lack of business talent or lack of interest in trade. The demise of the family's business is not just a social phenomenon. It is the story of one of the first globalized firms that suffered the consequences of rejecting modernization and the changing times. The rise of the Sassoon in the mid-19th century came from their ability to adapt to major political and technological changes. But paradoxically, it was their failure to do so afterwards that brought about their decline, as they could not properly assess the political, economic, and social changes that were sweeping Asia and the world at large. I also argue that the loss of their Arab Jewish identity was a major factor. Anglicization and the desperate need to be fully accepted by the English aristocracy led them to drift away from their traditions and from their businesses, to be men of leisure in their fancy estates, more interested in parties, horse racing, and hunting than dealing with the dramatic changes that were taking place around the globe. Thank you.
I think it falls to me to not only thank you very much, Professor Sassoon, for the talk and for a really wonderfully compelling book, but to kick off the discussion with a few questions, really, and thoughts. So I shall try to do that and keep them brief, so allow the maximum time for other people to respond. One of the questions that you address, and that I think is something that makes the reader think, is the secrets of their success. What was distinctive? What was special about them? And it seems, but I'd like to hear more about this, that there is something distinctive in their position as Baghdadi Jews, members of the Ottoman realm, but with these connections that take them east, comfortable in Arabic, with their own private Judeo-Arabic as well. There's something in that, their pride in their Baghdadi heritage appears to be very important. Of course, it wasn't just the Sassoons, although they were the most important dynasty, and there were the Kaduris and there were others. I'd like to hear more about that. And they navigate two empires rather intriguingly. I'm curious to hear a little more about their relationship to the Ottoman Empire, which appears to sort of vanish very quickly from their consciousness, and that may be an illusion. Some of them marry into Egyptian Jewish families, but it doesn't seem as though they preserved any sense of allegiance to the Ottoman sultans, and I'm not sure if they were ever comfortable in Turkish or ever needed to be comfortable in Turkish, but that may be part of the explanation. In any case, in the context of a conference on Sephardic Jewry, I think it's interesting to think a little bit about whether their commercial success was bound up with a very specific place within the Ottoman Imperium that allowed them to disengage from that rather quickly. And then conversely, of course, there is this embrace of the British Empire, but especially the embrace of British India. And there's a sense in the book that English culture is liberating for them so long as they're in British India. And it's a little more corrosive when they get too fond of England itself. And clearly this conjuncture where they coincide with the free trade boom of the 1830s and the 1840s, they happen to coincide with the spread of the steamships. They understand almost instinctively in this age of the great urbanization of certain new port cities, which port cities are going to be decisive for. They have an extraordinary flair for that. I would love to hear a little more about what language is meant to them. And I'm thinking about their private life. It seems as though Judeo-Arabic survives a generation or two as a kind of, amongst other things, a private familial language when you want to throw in the odd phrase of affection. That you can be more affectionate than you could be in English, say. And that brings me especially to Flora, who I think is one of the most fascinating characters in your book. This incredible woman who ends up running the business for a time. I would like to hear more about how she did it. She's not the only one, of course. There's Rachel Beer, who is whose dates are very similar, who ends up editing 2 national newspapers in England. These extraordinary achievements. The last thing, and actually the thing that intrigued me the most, however, is at a more general level, and that is the arc of the story that you tell. You know, one could imagine a very different, very moralizing, very critical story about, you know, the rise of the opium trade and capitalism and these compradors who get rich exploiting the population of China and so on. And that's not what you do, nor are you, I think, and rightly interested in defending them against that. I think it's an extraordinary sort of impartial analysis of the business of business. But it does seem to me that there is a kind of morality tale in your mind too. In fact, it even came up a little bit in the way you alluded to the successive generations, which is that the first generations embody virtues of thrift, of familial integrity, of early initiative, and the later generations squander things and quarrel with one another and dissipate the fortune. And of course it was so that was, if you were telling the story of the dynasty, that is the story of the fall of the dynasty. But from a sociological point of view, it would be quite interesting to take a slightly different view and look at the very many members of the third and fourth generations. They perhaps don't comprise such distinctive individuals, but what was the story, if you take it down a generation or two, presumably embedding themselves in an English middle class or traveling around the world, presumably without great wealth, but with a sense of a connection, so that if one didn't tell the story of Philip and Victor as the sort of playboy, profligate grandsons and great grandsons, but simply saw this as a kind of what happens to a great fortune as the generations merge, what would that story look like? So I shall stop there and hand back to Rebecca and hope I've left enough time for other people to ask questions. But thank you very much indeed.
Yes, and Joseph, you can answer now, but I would like to urge people to actually use either the chat function or there's one in the Q&A to ask questions, and then we'll also do that. But Joseph, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thanks for all these interesting and valuable comments. A couple of things, I think partly on the success. I would say being comfortable with different cultures was really, really very important. I mean, it seems that they got along with everyone. You look at correspondence with the Shah of Iran, and then the next day, the Sultan of Oman, entertaining the Prince of Wales for dinner at home. But at the same time, there is actually a very interesting connection. There is the oldest son, Abdullah, there is a lot of almost real friendship developed with some guy that he has never met in Isfahan. And he starts starts writing him letters when there are problems in the family. And they became really close. And I think that speaks to each other. And the other guy, of course, told him that he will never sell anything and except to the Sassoons. But I think wherever they went, they seem to have really managed, in spite of the fact that in the first and the second generation, as you pointed out correctly, their heritage, their Jewishness, their Arabness are so critical all for them. I think what really made them very successful in the first two generations, yes, they were in Bombay, it's a new city, and they were trying to adapt. Yes, even in England when they came. But I think at the time they really knew who they were, and they were not ashamed about it. I mean, when you look at later generations, by the time you get to Philip and Siegfried, there is a fundamental change. See, Philip Sassoon goes for 12 days to Iraq as Undersecretary of the Air Force. Doesn't mention one thing about the family, writes a book called The Third Route, 300 pages, and there isn't one thing about the family or saying, I returned to where my great-grandfather was born. Nothing. Let's forget it. I think in the crest I showed, by the time you get to Philip Sassoon and his sister, they tried to erase the Hebrew because they were trying to pretend that they are from Toledo in Spain. And I think that has a very important psychological aspect when you are dealing with so many people around the world. Who you are, what you are, your pride about it, your connection to it, I think it's very important. You're absolutely right that British India, they felt more comfortable. Once they moved to England, you know, it was a tough time because they were really suddenly straight away trying to compete with the aristocracy. And this, now it's not only big houses in London, but you have to buy hunting estates in Scotland and you have to entertain properly. And as a result, the languages began to disappear. There's wonderful correspondence between David to his sons when they were little about how important it is to learn English and how important to learn Arabic and how important to learn Hebrew, where by the third, fourth generation, let's only learn English and pretend to be English more than the English. I'm so glad you picked on Flora. I think she is one of the most fascinating people in this whole saga. You know, there are a couple of books that were published about the Sassoons, one in 1930, one in 1960. There is a Hebrew book. On average, they gave her 3 lines in the book and 6 pages to her husband. And then when you start going through the archives, you see how amazing it is. I gave a talk in one business school just about her modern ways of managing the business. She really almost, although it was the end of the 19th century, she almost brought the modern 20th century to running the business. But as the book tells the story, you know, the men in the family were not very happy about it. How did she do it? I think she was incredible. There is a report about her that she knew 7 languages. She knew most of Shakespeare by heart. This was at the age of 17, 18. Obviously, she had an incredible memory. I think that what distinguished her from all the others, that she had a marriage based on love. It was really a partnership rather than, okay, it's pre-arranged marriage, time has come. And that in itself, I think, played a big role in the sense that, you know, she insists to her husband 3-4 years before he dies that she wants to come to the office 3 times a week. That was unheard of. And Indian and other traders who were coming to the office couldn't understand how to handle the whole situation and shake hands with her. The story of opium is definitely a critical part. I tried my best, while maybe moralizing it or non-moralizing it, to look at it in the perspective of really mid-19th century and not in the year 2022. I think that what the story from a sociological point of view, I go back to the first point you made. I think the fact that they really didn't know who they were not anymore attacked. I met actually one of my cousins who took even his father changed even the name Sassoon because he thought maybe someone is going to connect it to being Jewish and being a Baghdadi, and that was kind of considered a shame. So I think I'm going to stop here because there is only about 10, 12 minutes, 15 minutes, and I'm happy to come back to some of your points. Thank you.
So thank you so much. I want all the questions to come out. So there are 3 excellent questions, and then you can answer them in how you want in these last few minutes. And I have a little one just to add. So Max Greenberg asks, what does this history teach us about the racial locations of Baghdadi Sephardim under British imperial capitalism? I would actually ask you, did they call themselves Sephardim in the second half of the 19th century? How does this inform racialization of this sphere of the Sephardi diaspora in the US in the 20th and 21st centuries? So that's Max's question. Emily asks, to what extent were the Sassoons or other Baghdadi Jewish families involved in trade in the French imperial sphere? And how did they connect to merchants there or were culturally influenced by the Alliance schools? And finally, the conveners ask a question of you. How do you position yourself in relationship to your work? Indeed, considering the familial connection, what types of sources were you able to access? How were you able to read against the grain? And then I'm going to now ask you a question as a person who wrote on your own family and your own personal history prior to entering the academy in finance, in business. What are the lessons of the Sassoon family? So I've been taking notes from the beginning of your talk. It seems like if I want to give advice in a business school of how to be successful, the lessons of your book is have a lot of children, learn a lot of languages, know who you are. You keep saying that, and I want to understand what you mean by that, because I actually see your story as one of success. They feel part of being in England and they don't want to be part of their former lives, which in the American paradigm is successful acculturation. But I'm wondering how successful it is. But what do you think is the lesson of your book? So that's my question. So those are the 4 final questions, and we can go a little over.
Sure.
But that is where we're going to sum up today. And I want you to think about the questions that I'm asking vis-a-vis this larger question of what thinking about non-Ashkenazi Jews can teach us about business. Because if you want to say the Rothschilds have been written over and over again, what does your exploration of this dynasty show us anew about Jews and business and capitalism and empire, all the big themes you raised?
Just before going to the question, I realized I missed one of the points that Professor Mazower asked about the Ottoman Empire. You are absolutely right. Interestingly enough, there was less connection as they left. I mean, they were trading with Turkey. Much stronger relationship with Persia at the time. They actually ended up opening an office or a branch in one of the cities in Iran. They kept going back to Baghdad for a long time. And they did, I think in the late 1880s, there was an attack on the Jewish community in Baghdad. They wrote letters to the Sultan and the big Vizier to protest and to intervene. The real connection was really Baghdad and not the Ottoman Empire. I mean, they said they spoke Turkish. I assume definitely the father and David knew Turkish very well because that was the main language. So the word Sephardic does not appear in the book. They really did not see them. And Sephardic, I don't have to tell this group, is from the word Sfarad, which means Spain. There is no connection to Spain. Some of the Sassoons, as I said later on, maybe would have loved to have that connection, but it's not. They all the time saw themselves either as Baghdadi Jews, number one, or Arab Jews. And that's the way they saw themselves. So what history teach us this thing about the British? I think that very interestingly, I argue that in a way, the British accepted the Sassoons more than they accepted the Rothschilds, and easier. Anti-Semitism was rife in the late 19th century and 20th century. And for two main reasons, I think. One, the fact that because of anti-Semitism, they did not trade in money lending. So they could not put that a profile of money lenders on them. Two, unlike the Rothschilds, whom they saw at some point as nouveau riche, trying to break into higher society, they saw them as already kind princes that were at very eminent level, which a little bit connects to your question, Rebecca. It's interesting. This is not a story of rags to riches to rags. It's actually from riches to rags to riches to a major decline. I mean, it's almost four stages rather than three. French imperialism comes into effect only in the after World War I. They are trying desperately to get rid of what was left from the opium boxes that they couldn't sell anymore to China, but they had already purchased. There is correspondence with the French in Vietnam and other areas, but the French were actually the first who connected to them. But it was a very, very small and really very little connection to French, rarely in any of the correspondence. I did not have any resource that anyone could not, or any researcher could not have. I talk about the different archives around. The big treasure for me that convinced me to write the book was finding at the National Library in Jerusalem 150 boxes, each box with hundreds and hundreds of these documents that I showed. Newspapers, whether in China, whether in India, archives and the Ottoman archives. There is an archive in Dallas, Texas of Victor Sassoon. China, the India National Archives, all those combined. Obviously, they're open. As someone who has the name Sassoon, there was nothing. I did go a couple of times to the library, Sassoon Library. They really have, apart from newspapers, they did not have anything. Let me just come to your question, and I'm sorry if I missed anything, please let me know. What are the lessons? Well, I think you have to be hungry. And I think the first chapter, the first generation, second generation were very, very hungry for success and wanted to prove themselves. This is not something different from any dynasties that was created around the world in any culture or any language. There are books and seminars. In fact, I am the talk on Saturday at the Financial Times is about intergenerational wealth. So I think, yes, having the languages and understanding the culture, I think it's definitely, but the end of it, it really needs about the ability to see in the outside. There were a lot of global merchants at the right time there in India or China or other places, but did not make money. They definitely were able to see out of the box, as you call it, but they were also fortunate. These wars happen. Opium is legalized. There is demand for the commodity. Cotton changes with the American Civil War. And they figured out that everything is globalized earlier than anyone else. And the fact that in 1854, he sends one of his sons to London is definitely a plus. Having lots of children absolutely is a criteria, because later on, Sir Victor Sassoon dies and he has no children. Philip Sassoon dies and no children. So from having so many to choose from, at least one or two or three who are talented and interested in the business, If you're having none, then it's none. And if you're having one or two, and both of them are not interested, and that's the greatness of the Rothschild. The focus on the business continued throughout generation, although a number of Rothschilds, in fact, a lot more and more, opted to be out of the business, but still some of them were interested in continuing this. Philip Sassoon, that Professor Mazower mentioned, 13 years as a chairman, did not write one business letter in his archive, not one. So when you think about this, how could you be chairman? Well, it's nice to be chairman. It's the title, it's the salary, it's the ability to spend it on art and other things, but zero interest in the business. And that tells you the story of these dynasties.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm sure if other questions arise, you can email Professor Sassoon, but on behalf of the conference conveners, I just want to thank you for this wonderful talk, for the wonderful book. Professor Mazower, thank you for your response. And I'm sure this is, it's hard to say, this is the Zoom. We're at the midway point of the conference, right? They already had one day meeting yesterday, and then next week there's another. So thank you for this keynote. And Nancy, do you have any other messages for those in attendance?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much to Joseph, to Mark, and to Rebecca for this fabulous conversation. Our second set of panels is going to be happening this coming Monday, May 9th. The first is on relational approaches to Ottoman studies with faculty respondents Andreas Guidi and Devin Nahr. And the second on ethnic studies, Jewish studies in Palestine with Keith Feldman and Evan Lai Espiritu Gandhi. So we hope to see you all then.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all, and much appreciated.